We're joined by Dr. Showalter Johnson, the leader of the Commonwealth Embassy Group, who's written a new book entitled The Algorithm of Leadership, A Guide to a New World. A philosopher who's known as the scientist of soul and doctor of desires. In this book, Dr. Johnson defines leadership and where it should be going or not. To begin with, why did you decide to write this book about a very rapidly changing world, and why actually now?
I wrote this book on leadership at this point in time because I realized that leaders aren't predicting anything. That's number one. But let me explain that. What do I mean by not predicting anything? As you know, we have a lot of crisis and climate change and many different things taking place in the world today. Leaders aren't helping us to attain the future. Many people have questions about business models. Which business models are going to last, remain, and which business models are going to disappear? A leader asked me this question when JCPenney's closed down. It's 850 stores. They started to come to this realization that perhaps some business models will stay, will last, and some will disappear. And I began to speak about business models that would disappear and the ones would last. We also spoke about cabinet leaders. What type of cabinet leaders in the future should politicians hire or recruit for their cabinet? And I spoke about leaders who are a part of the sciences from nature. And they asked me a question, what about an economist? And I said, an economist tells us nothing. And we've seen that over the years with the WTO and all of those different sectors. Economists have not been able to help to change the economic conditions in the world today. And so the question was, why is it that an economist should not be on the cabinet of the presidential leadership? Because I said, an economist comes from an egoistic standpoint. In other words, you purchase something for $1 and sell it for 1,000. And so this type of leader is someone who I would not suggest to be in the future on cabinet board. The other thing was a university professor asked me, what do I see in the future concerning different topics that they're being taught in school. And I said to them, there are certain topics that will disappear. And so this is why I said leaders aren't predicting anything, and we need leaders who can predict the future. Secondly is that I wrote this book on leadership in this time because the first lesson of leadership, James, is how to exist correctly. This is the problem with most leaders today, from presidents, prime ministers, to pastors of churches. They have not learned the first lesson of leadership, how to teach people how to exist correctly, how to imagine correctly.
You've warned that there are storm clouds coming, a storm is coming, and that if we don't actually heed that warning, there's even the risk of civil war. That claim would have seemed fairly outlandish before what happened in the Capitol in the United States, in Washington, very recently, that people took the law at that time into their own hands. Why do you warn of storm clouds? Why do you warn of a possible civil war if things are not corrected?
Well, first of all, in the book I speak about deciphering democracy. Democracy is a noble notion. However, I believe it's a figment of our imagination. And that's very bold to say. Why would I say that? Democracy simply means equality for all, freedom of speech, and justice.
You're right, it doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist. It's a figment of our imagination. For example, no one have ever taught us how to preserve equality. We don't know how to find equivalence. The answer to finding equivalence or equality is learning the secrets of mutual guarantee and mutual responsibility. So I speak about that in this book. First of all, we need the leadership that teaches the next generation how to be equal with each other. And equality doesn't mean being the same. That's getting inclusion wrong. Equality means that I can be diverse but still included in the conversation. It means that it's the law of similarities.
You beg to differ. You beg to differ.
Yeah, I beg to differ. And then we speak about justice. Democracy is about justice. Well, we have seen civil rights fighting for black people. Much haven't changed. We've seen fighting for inequality for women in the workplace. Much haven't changed. We haven't seen much women in politics. They are cascaded and pulled down. We've seen the same thing with domestic violence, fighting for justice, and much have not changed because there is a falsehood of social justice. And I think a lot of leaders would rather focus on justice rather than the root, which is love. So social justice is another surrogate for love. When there is true love, we don't need to use the word integrity any longer. When there is true love, we don't need to use the word values because love is the root of all. And so it's a surrogate, it's an excuse to focus, shift our direction from the love your neighbor as yourself concept.
You mentioned that the United States should be seen as a microcosm for leadership around the world. What happens in the United States will ripple through, the ripple effect through. Some Muslim countries that are ruled in a very different way wouldn't agree with that. But why do you feel that the US system is the template for leadership that we should be looking to?
Well, to be honest with you, I beg to differ. I don't believe that the United States is the template. In my book, I speak about it being the microcosm in a sense that whenever something happens in the United States, for example, I am from the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. They say the place where the Lord lives. When something happens in the United States, when they sneeze, we feel the effect of it. You saw the same thing in the election with Trump. They call him a populist. And whatever took place in that election in the United States, you saw the same movements and patterns and sequences, blueprints and frameworks taking place in France. You saw it in different places. And so, yes, that's why I said that the United States have become this microcosm, because you saw certain behaviors. Trump was he was the contrarian against a certain political movement. And then you saw contrarians rising up in different countries. But that still doesn't give the United States the power to become the template. I believe that the society that have been called to be the true template is Israel. However, at this point in time, she is not exhibiting that behavior. Small little sparks we can sense from Israel, but when she really finds herself, she's the only nation that can provide the templates for correction, and the only nation that can correct China as well, because China is a very difficult place to deal with. But Israel is the place that can bring correction to the world when she finds her position.
You mentioned the problems, and they're very serious problems, of migration and also the border wall. We've talked about this previously. I think you mentioned in your book, if I'm correct, please correct me if I'm not correct, 77 border walls around the world. And I mentioned that perhaps 78 by the time we do this interview. But you've mentioned that migration and immigration and the border wall are symptoms of a much deeper problem. I think the word phenomenological is something you mentioned, that it's people think, oh, it was President Trump, but the problem is deeper and wider than any politician, isn't it?
Yes, they blame Trump for everything. Let's look at it. There are 77 walls. I speak about it in my book. 77 walls. But let's date back 30 years ago to Berlin. As you know, there was a wall there, and people lobbied for the wall to be removed. Once the wall was removed, persons from one side ran to the next side, and from the one side ran to the other side, and there was such excitement. But as time passed, 30 years later, we realized that there's still an invisible wall. And that takes us to this point that the true wall is actually in our hearts.
In our mind and hearts. Yeah.
Our minds and our hearts. And so removing the wall today would be the Demis fight to remove the wall in Mexico. But when we date back 30 years, we realize that moving walls did not do anything because the wall stayed in the hearts of the people. And so placing a wall, on the other hand, does not do anything for immigration. Because when we look at immigration policies, when I look at immigration policies, I'm going to start from what I call phenomenological models of leadership, because humanity is a natural phenomenon. Several thousand years ago, we came to this planet and we saw species living here, plants and animals that lived on a single organism. They lived as a single organism. They were more integral, interconnected. And we learned from those gestures as humans and that culture. It means that humans are tied together by invisible wires. This is how leaders must diagnose humanity in order to attain the future. And if humans are tied together by invisible wires, if we are integrated, if we are headed to a global village, then placing a wall or giving more monies for funding to police our borders is not going to deal with the situation. A crisis is a question. It's not an answer, it's a question. And so we need to look at it this way, that humans are integrally connected together, and imagine pulling a child away from its mother and the child is crying. It's the same thing that political leaders do when we don't understand that it's a natural phenomenon for us to want to migrate, to be integrally connected with each other. So the answer here is that we need integral education within our schools. I am not saying that we need to remove the border control police officers and all of that stuff. I am simply saying that we need to rise above the current conversation like you and I are having and say, hey, this is natural for people to want to migrate and to integrate with each other. Perhaps let's teach integral education. Let's teach that.
Is the fact that Donald Trump was, as you've mentioned in your book, the unexpected leader, is that part of the reason that he was so polarizing for so many people in the United States and other parts of the world?
Yes, the unexpected leader. Because of this wall in Mexico, they made it seem like Trump was the first one to build a wall. Like we said, there are 77, I think, between Pakistan and India, and you can go on and on and on. But he was not the first one to build a wall. Am I for the wall? No. Because there's a greater situation that I'm focusing on. In this case, the left and the right, they are not understanding immigration. It is about integral education that is going to solve this problem.
how can we get past? You just mentioned the left and the right, the Democrats and the Republicans. How can we get past this structure? How can we get past a structure that's become a stricture?
Excellent question. We must go to the origin of the left and the right. I think it was in France. They wanted to vote for a king. And there was a group of people who were for it, and there were a group of people who were against it. This is where the origin and the etymology of the left and the right came from. But because I'm a student of science, let's go a little bit deeper. The left and the right can also be found in nature, positive and negative. When a child is born, there is a particular proclivity and tendency to vote for the left or the right. It's a spiritual force in nature. He doesn't know when his desires leads him this way. For some reason, he feels like he is a leftist, or for some reason the person feel like they have this proclivity to lean into the right. The way to deal with the left and the right is we have to rise above it, because there is a society that lives in exile, James, and they are the betweeners. We need to begin to look at this society that is in exile, that is in between, because these are the people who are struggling and suffering more than any person today. We need to look at the left and the right. We need to try to integrate these two together to find a common denominator, like in mathematics with equations. You have 2 over 4, then you have 1 over 4, then you have these, and you want to find the common denominator. We need to find the common denominator between the left and the right, because a question was asked. When you look at the racial divide versus the religious divide, which one is more dangerous? My answer was this: the political divide is more dangerous than the racial divide or the religious divide. And the person asked me why. And I said, because politicians turns people against each other.
You've mentioned in the book that a number of times, looking to the coming generation of leaders to be able to see a different type of leader, somebody who's more in tune with the world as it truly is. Does that mean that you've more or less, or we've more or less given up on the leaders we've got now?
Not necessarily, because we need to focus on leadership at hand. But I believe that you cannot teach an old dog new tricks. And it's very easy to focus on the younger generation because they're more open to this type of leadership in the future. And the older generation, they're somewhat stuck in their ways. And so, whilst we are still providing leadership in the book for this generation, we want to go to the younger generation to help them to understand where the world is headed. It's headed in a mysterious direction, James.
Also, the importance of embracing, as you've mentioned already, diversity, and to reinforce it with inclusion. Just because a person is different, it doesn't mean they're less. Are leaders actually acknowledging or even recognizing this?
No, we're not. When we look at Joe Biden and his party, they created race theory, critical race theory. And critical race theory is all about providing more courses in the universities and in the schools about blacks and about what they have encountered. Racism, of course, it's real, don't get me wrong. But they have vasculated Black life, Black Lives Matter topics about, and also giving remunerations or academic scholarships for persons who would adhere or focus in this area of critical race theory. I think that Joe Biden got inclusion incorrect. It's not correct. And the reason why I'm saying that, it is because once you vasculate the study of Black Lives Matter, you increase the hatred that's already in black people because of the true hurt and segregation that they have encountered over the years. So it is true what my people have encountered. But as a leader, what would I do if I was the President of the United States? I would remove quickly critical race theory and replace it with what I call integrative race theory, which really means I would take a look at the 4 major ethnicities, which is, first of all, you're white, and the true whites are from Europe. You're very pale. Handsome at that. And then you have the whites from the United States, but they're really the rednecks. They're red. And then you have the blacks from Africa. And then you have the yellow from Asia. Those are the 4 major ethnicities. Black Lives Matter, yes. But to try to develop critical race theory is creating this type of inclusion, and you're getting it wrong. You're damaging my people more for their votes. What I want to do is remove critical race theory and replace it with integrative race theory, which really means getting young people from these 4 major ethnicities. I know there are other ethnicities like Latinos and Brazilians and Indians, but all of those are from the integration of these 4 ethnicities, probably 2 here, 2 there. But let's start with the 4 major ethnicities and start a conversation with the yellow, the Asians and the blacks and the whites and the reds, and get them to integrate. Start developing more courses in our schools, in our preschools, in our universities, based around the 4 major ethnicities.
From the very start.
From the very start. And I want to go deeper here, James, because it's important. And my theory, if I was the president, I would say that these 4 major ethnicities also represents 4 desires of human development. And if we can get these 4 major ethnicities to understand each other's desires, which may be different, and to respect that they are diverse, we can take diversity and make inclusion work and bring change. So this is my leadership model to bring correction to what we're seeing today with critical race theory and diversity and inclusion.
We're always looking for heroes in leaders. One example, Martin Luther King, who changed the way that everybody thinks. It's a what-if question. It's an impossible question. But if he hadn't been assassinated, if he'd lived and he continued his work, would we be living in a very different world today?
Yes, we would be. And it would not be just because of Martin Luther. I love him a lot. But it would be different because we look at the meaning and the definition of humanity as a leader. What is the definition of humanity? A human is not satisfied being human. That's the beauty of it, because he wants to be more. And that goes back to the soul, meaning that the soul, which is the desire in humans, are always evolving and perpetuating to become more. You saw it, for example, if I use anthropology to measure the desires from Martin Luther's time, even though he's not here, I can tell you, I'm using anthropology. I can measure his desires and the desires of the people from the civil rights movement, and you measure those people to this day who are still living, their desires have perpetuated so much that is scary. So much that democracy cannot beat human nature. And the human nature is pregnant with a type of desire that Martin Luther King, even if he was living, did not experience when he first marched for the black people's rights.
Is it relevant to look back in history even further to somebody like Moses, who had to, as a leader, overcome so many obstacles? 525 of his prayers were ignored. 2, he had to keep going back to an increasingly hostile Pharaoh to try to get the Israelites freed from basic slavery. Also, 70 different diverse peoples he had to take to Mount Sinai. All of these different boulders, obstacles that he had to either go over, around, under, or find some way to overcome. He did it in spite of all of the difficulties, in spite of the rivalries and the jealousies. Is he a true role model?
Yes, Moses is a true role model because he learned from Abraham. Abraham was the spiritual father of nations because he was the one who first founded nations. He went to Nimrod, who was building a huge, humongous building, and he told them, this hierarchical structure that you're developing, you're going to get in trouble because it's based around self-interest. And I want to teach you how to remove away from self-interest to integration. And so Moses learned from Abraham how to develop an integral society, because this one that we're living in today is not it. So we have to create leaders who understand what Moses did. He took 70 nations, rise them above hatred. Hatred in the Hebrew means, Sinai in the Hebrew means hatred.
The mountain.
So he raised them above their own hatreds, helping them to correct their desires, and they became an integral society. This is why Moses was so powerful. But this is actually the best quality of Moses. I love it the most. In the ending parts of Deuteronomy, Moses was very old and wimpy and weary. And it is written that Moses' eyes were still undimmed. In other words, dim means when your eyes are closing down and you're weak. But even in his old age, his eyes were still bright. His vision was still strong, because vision starts from the end. Moses was consistent, and I want every young politician, every leader, every pastor, everyone who say that they've been called to lead people, do not start propagating and talking about your vision and what you're going to do for your constituents. And then the first obstacle that you experience, you are bought out from one political party to the next. And then people begin to wonder if they can trust your vision. Moses did not do this. His eyes were undimmed until the end.
You mentioned the story of the old lady of Acklands within the Bahamas with 2 jealous sons, envy and jealousy being part and parcel of leadership, and that one was told to cut the cake and the other was chosen to actually select the slice that he wanted. Is that a microcosm of leadership and where we're failing right now?
Yes, because when this lady told her sons, Jacob and Esau, she gave them responsibilities and roles. One was to cut the cake and one was to choose. This is a game, and it's a game, and it's also a type of game that teaches us how to preserve equality. At the end of the day, you could imagine that one could not become upset with the other because the one was able to choose the cake. No. The other can say, I sliced the cake and you chose the cake. And so the mother played a game with them and showed them that we are all in this together. Mutual responsibility is what we call game theory with this game. And so we live in a simulator. Merrill Lynch got together with scientists and billionaires, and they wanted to fund this effort because they finally realized that we lived in a matrix. And we do. We live in a simulator. And everything have already been designed for us. And I think it's very interesting in leadership to design games in the workplace for persons to play that will help them to evolve to the next phase of development. And this is what this old lady from Acklands did. Acklands is a small little island where my mom and dad is from, rather. And it's interesting.
Part of the Bible says that the meek shall inherit the earth. Very few leaders are meek by nature. Very few take criticism or constructive criticism in the way it is meant to be intended and used against them. Some of them might question you, saying, why does Dr. Johnson actually write this book and show us how to be leaders? We're leaders already. What are you trying to actually say to them? What is your message to them?
I want them to know that there is a difference between a leader and a dictator. A dictator leads from the top down. A true leader doesn't really need to be at the top. He can simply embed himself in between and among. Moses was considered a very modest leader because this was his model. He would embed himself in between and among because he knew that the receptions between people needed to stay clean in order for them to be an integral society. And so this is why this leadership model is different. Do not seek to lead from the head down. Seek to lead between and among.
Dr. Johnson, if you have the opportunity in the future to actually lead a country yourself, let's say the Bahamas, what sort of leader would you try to be?
I would try to model after Moses because he was very modest and he was not a dictator. He didn't lead from the top down. He embedded himself between and among the people to ensure that the connectivity between humanity, the receptions were clean. And by doing this, we could together build an integral society for all.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Well, it's been fascinating doing the interview with you, Dr. Johnson, about the book. And it's a challenging book. And part of the way through it, you say, if you've got this far, I think anyone who is interested in leadership will get that far and a lot further. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much.